Good morning, everybody. This is Pastor John with another edition of Monday Morning Quarterback. So yesterday we talked about the semi-famous story, I guess, about the prophet Elijah who was hiding up in the mountains from soldiers, and God comes to him. But first, before God comes, there's an earthquake and a fire and wind. But God was not in the earthquake. God was not in the fire. God was not in the wind. And then it says God was, and according to the King James Version, it says God was in the still small voice. And I love that phrase, the still small voice of the Spirit. It's a beautiful phrase because it emphasizes something that we don't think about with God a lot. We always think of God in terms of He is powerful, He is almighty, all these things, and can do all these earth-shattering things, right? And yet, you know, this God speaks to us in the still small voice of the Spirit. And, you know, that's actually very consistent with God, the God of the Bible. Even though He is all powerful and all those things, most of the time God speaks to us in ways that we probably would not have really noticed it were we not paying attention, up to and including when God became one of us in the form of a small child, born to insignificant parents in a nowhere town in an occupied nation. God is frequently coming to us in some version of the still small voice of the Spirit, if you will. But that's the King James Version, and I don't really use the King James Version in my preaching and teaching. However, in the New Revised Standard Version of this episode from 1 Kings, it says God was not in the fire, or God was not in the wind, God was not in the earthquake, but God was in the sheer silence. The sheer silence. That's how the New Revised Standard Version calls the still small voice. And quite honestly, the sheer silence is probably a more accurate translation of the ancient Hebrew. But I thought about that phrase. And in the sermon, I was talking about the still small voice of the Spirit, because the poetry of that really kind of inspired me, I think. But I wanted to talk a little bit today about that, the sheer silence, because we don't think about that a lot. We don't think about or talk about the silence of God. And if we do, we talk about it as if it's problematic. God was silent and these things happened and God was silent. And all the silence of God really means is that no one is perceiving God at work. But because no one perceives God at work does not mean that God is not at work. So the sheer silence does not mean necessarily the sheer absence of God. It simply means that no one is perceiving God's presence. And yet, on that mountain, in that cave, even in the sheer silence, Elijah perceived the presence of God, and they spoke to one another. God is in the still small voice. God is in the sheer silence. But the thing about those things, about the still small voice of the Spirit, or the sheer silence, however you want to look at that, the thing about that is that the sheer silence, the still small voice, it forces us to pay attention. It forces us to move beyond the clutter and the noise and the distractions of our culture, which our culture is full of. It forces us to move beyond those, to see beyond those, to hear beyond those, to listen beyond those, to look beyond those. Because God is often not in the noise, even noise that we often associate with God. But God is in the sheer silence, in the movement of the Spirit. If we can learn to listen, we might still hear. Have a wonderful week, my friends. God bless.